This video is a reading of the homework passage titled Slavery in the American South. The introduction to the passage reads as follows. No issue has more scarred our country, nor had more long-term effects than slavery. When we celebrate American freedom, we must also be mindful of the long and painful struggle to share in those freedoms that faced and continue to face generations of African Americans. To understand the present, we must look to the past. The following is from the section of the passage titled Buying and Selling Slaves. Before the Civil War, nearly 4 million black slaves toiled in the American South. Modern scholars have assembled a great deal of evidence showing that few slaves accepted their lack of freedom or enjoyed life on the plantation. As one ex-slave put it, no day dawns for the slave, nor is it looked for. It's all night, night forever. For many, the long night of slavery only ended in death. In 1841, a bounty hunter kidnapped Solomon Northup, a free black man from Saratoga, New York, on the pretext that he was a runaway slave from Georgia. When the bounty hunter sold him into slavery, Northup lost his family, his home, his freedom, and even his name. Solomon Northup was taken to New Orleans, Louisiana, where he was put into a slave pen with other men, women, and children waiting to be sold. In 12 Years a Slave, a narrative that Northup wrote after he regained his freedom, the citizen of New York described what it was like to be treated as human property. Freeman, the white slave broker, would make us hold up our heads, walk briskly back and forth, while customers would feel of our heads and arms and bodies, turn us about, ask us what we could do, make us open our mouths and show our teeth. Sometimes a man or woman was taken back to the small house in the yard, stripped and inspected more minutely. Scars upon a slave's back were considered evidence of a rebellious or unruly spirit and hurt his sale. By law, slaves were the personal property of their owners in all southern states except Louisiana. The slave master held absolute authority over his human property, as the Louisiana law made clear. The master may sell him, dispose of his person, his industry, and his labor. The slave can do nothing, possess nothing, nor acquire anything but what must belong to his master. Slaves had no constitutional rights. They could not testify in court against a white person. They could not leave the plantation without permission. Slaves often found themselves rented out, used as prizes in lotteries, or as wagers in card games and horse races. Separation from friends and family was probably the greatest fear a black person in slavery faced. When a master died, his slaves were often sold for the benefit of his heirs. Solomon Northup himself witnessed a sorrowful separation in the New Orleans slave pen, when a slave buyer purchased a mother, but not her little girl. The child, sensible of some impending danger, instinctively fastened her hands around her mother's neck and nestled her little head upon her bosom. Freeman, the slave broker, sternly ordered the mother to be quiet, but she did not heed him. He caught her by the arm and pulled her rudely, but she clung closer to the child. Then with a volley of great oaths, he struck her such a heartless blow that she staggered backwards and was like to fall. Oh, how piteously then did she beseech and beg and pray that they not be separated. Perhaps out of pity, the buyer did offer to purchase the little girl, but the slave broker refused, saying there would be, quote, piles of money to be made of her when she got older. The next section is titled Slave Resistance. In 12 Years a Slave, Solomon Northup reported one instance in which a young slave woman named Patsy was brutally whipped for visiting a neighboring plantation without permission. The painful cries and shrieks of the tortured Patsy, mingling with the loud and angry curses of Epps, the slave master who was whipping her, loaded the air. She was terribly lacerated, I may say without exaggeration, literally flayed. The lash was wet with blood. How did the slaves react to the whippings, the endless labor for others' profit, the lack of freedom? Some, like Nat Turner, rebelled. In 1831, he led a slave revolt that left nearly 60 white persons dead in Virginia. Such insurrections were relatively rare in the South. White people outnumbered slaves in most places, possessed firearms, and could call on the power of the government to suppress rebellions. Nevertheless, slaves everywhere found other ways to resist their bondage. They sabotaged tools and crops, pretended illness, and stole food from the master's own kitchen. The most effective way that a slave could retaliate against an owner was to run away. It is estimated that 60,000 black people fled slavery before the Civil War. Solomon Northup attempted to run away but failed. Then in 1852, a white carpenter with abolitionist sentiments met Northup and learned about his kidnapping. The carpenter wrote several letters to New York state officials on behalf of Northup. In response, the governor of New York sent an agent carrying documents proving that Northup was a free black man. After a court hearing in January 1853, a Louisiana judge released Northup from his bondage. He finally returned home to his wife and children. When Solomon Northup wrote the narrative of his experiences in 1853, he left little doubt about his feelings towards slave owners. A day may come, it will come, a terrible day of vengeance, when the master in his turn will cry in vain for mercy. The following are some reading response questions that you need to answer. You can download this from Portals under the Homework tab. The first question: what was the legal status of slaves and their families? On your printed reading passage sheet, highlight at least 2 sentences in the section titled Buying and Selling Slaves that give you that information. Number 2, what are 3 ways that slaves resisted their enslavement? Highlight at least 3 sentences in the section titled Slave Resistance that give you this information. And number 3, in 1850, a Southern slave owner might have said something like this: "Our slaves are like children who need to be cared for and disciplined. They are content and actually better off than free white laborers working in northern factories." How do you think Solomon Northup would have responded to these remarks? Type your answers in well-written, detailed sentences, and you will turn your homework in next class.